Welcome back to Counsel Culture. It's been a little while since we have recorded, but really happy to be back with you. And there's certainly a lot of big news stories for us to dig through. As we record this, Labour are facing a potential leadership challenge. The industry is still reeling from an insider trading scandal, and we've seen Anthropic make a big play for the legal sector. I am joined today by Ben and Alex, and we are going to get started. But first off, how are you both? How's your week's been?
I'll go first, Alex. My week's been good. We've seen a lot of action in the private equity space. So I think, as regular listeners will know, we for Agreed, who have made an investment into Iceland this week, acquiring a firm into the Agreed group there, and that's got a lot of press coverage, and there really is a lot of momentum. We're having some very interesting conversations with that are private equity related in terms of law, and what we saw at the beginning of this calendar year being a potentially pretty focused, big area of focus for us is absolutely coming to pass. So my head's been in the investment space this week with a bit of politics.
Great. How about you, Alex? Because I know we have released this week a report in partnership with Constructive. Do you want to just chat a bit about that quickly?
No, yeah, this is they're Constructive are a big web developer who do a lot of stuff in the legal sector. That they do some annual benchmarking of legal brands, the biggest law firms globally and in the UK. So this is based on sort of things like SEMrush and Google Analytics. So it's got a lot of good stuff in there on how big an audience you do or don't reach. And this is, some of these figures are enormous. So I think Owen Mitchell's got like near 4% of the market off the top of my head. There's a lot of very big patterns of who does or doesn't reach an audience. People actually often forget that in terms of how you communicate your brand and interact, millions of people can be interacting with these law firms through their website. So it has a big impact in brand and reputation terms.
Great. And if anyone's interested in checking that out, then you can find it on our website or Constructive's website. Definitely worth a read. So I think it would be remiss if we didn't address the leadership battle currently going on in the Labour Party. And just to add that obviously we at Byfield are apolitical, but it certainly raises some really interesting challenges from a communications perspective. And Ben, I know you've been drawing some comparisons too.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate that we at Byford are apolitical, I think it's important that we remain to be seen as so. And actually, no one's really interested in our personal political views. However, from a communications perspective, it's clearly been a bit of a car crash, hasn't it? In terms of what is going on there. Strikes me that Starmer seems to be has been completely oblivious to the sort of mood music around him, and is sort of could have communicated something. Totally understand that he wants to stay in power, but he could have communicated something to do with leadership battles, and I don't think he really has. I do think there are some analogies with partnerships, aren't there? And I'm always struck in law firms, even the biggest ones, and I remember Dewey LaBeouf going down, when things start to go wrong in law firms, they tend to go wrong pretty quickly from a sort of leadership governance perspective. And I see echoes of that here. And I think some of the messaging around, they got the Andy Burnham thing quite wrong, didn't they? When, he really should have let him stand for that by-election a little while ago that looked a lot more orderly. And now, I guess from a communications perspective, Starmer does look quite weak, doesn't he? He looks quite weak. He looks not in control of his brief, not really cognizant of what has been going on, and now at a point where his leadership is being openly challenged, and I think as a direct result. So I think the learnings for any type of leader is be across your brief and be seen to be across your brief and be able to talk about your brief. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing now is a direct result of him kind of, I don't know, almost being slopey shouldered about things and sort of passing responsibility and knowledge and everything else.
Yeah, I think there's one specific issue that, however you feel about the policy or where people sit on the spectrum, Starmer is a poor communicator, and being the Prime Minister of Great Britain puts a particular premium on being a strong communicator and an educator, and having some ability to interact, read the mood of your own MPs, the country, and sometimes tell them what they don't want to hear, and set the terms or the political weather. If you bring that back to leadership in general or in law firms, I mean, I think the most successful senior partner that I knew, managing partner, told me once that he had to spend about a third of his time communicating, and it's tiring and it's knackering and it's a particular learned skill, but it's very rare to see certainly a senior politician, from my experience of when I was a business journalist, a successful leader who is not very fluent and a very powerful communicator. There are exceptions, but they're pretty rare.
And with such a public loss in confidence, is it possible for Starmer to row back from this? And just more generally, what does it take to reposition your brand and your reputation in the midst of such public criticism? Do you think there's a way back for him?
I think it's a really good question, and obviously not going to give you a sort of political expert's view, but from a sort of leadership observation of him, when he has expressed sort of regret and remorse, i.e. the Mandelson affair, which we absolutely don't want to go over again, it always seems robotic and a little bit qualified. I think I really fully agree with Alex that Starmer is not a good communicator, because he doesn't really come across as he is authentic, but he doesn't really come across as having sort of much of a personality, and he seems to communicate by sort of a playbook as opposed to anything that's from the gut. I think for me, I think his only chance, and did try and do this the other day when he gave that speech, and he slightly cringingly rolled his sleeves up and took his jacket off and all that, is to look as if he's coming from the gut and from the heart. I think that's his only play. It's not so much what he says, it's how he says it. I think it sounds slightly simplistic, but I think sometimes as a leader, you need that kind of cold authority, and then sometimes you need that just ability to gut punch. And I think all he's got now, if it's a heavyweight title fight, he's massively down on points in the final round, and his best chance is a haymaker. He needs to find his haymaker. What do you think, Alex?
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I mean, it's very hard to see him coming back. I mean, it's funny how you learn to communicate you are or project your personality, because you have somebody, by all accounts, who is intelligent. He's generally felt to have integrity. Some people may debate that. I'll take a different view, but that's many people who encounter him think that. And he's also from a fairly working class background in a party that's supposed to like that, and he should be somebody who is a personal story of success, and yet he's not seen as that. That's not connected with a public image. So there's an odd sense of a lot of the evidence of who the underlying person is, but then how that translates into his public image and how he articulates and projects himself. That's kind of, he's almost a sort of strange case study of how you cannot effectively draw on parts of yourself and give a message or give a sense of the thing that it is you're leading. I'm not quite sure why that is or what it says, but it should have got a lot better, really.
There was those of readers of our listeners, of a much older persuasion may remember, and I was at school at this point, so I'm not that old, but when John Major faced a leadership challenge, he was seen as a pretty poor robotic communicator at the time, and there was a big leadership challenge against him, and he was overheard describing his cabinet as bastards, which I think I'm allowed to say on the podcast, and I got picked up, and I remember there was a headline in one of the papers that just said "bastards!" and it's from him, and then his popularity soared from that. And that's kind of my point. I'm not saying Keir Starmer should question the legitimacy of his fellow cabinet colleagues, but something from his heart would be. But
you're right, but you've also got to be able to look authentic. We've had decades of prime ministers who pretend to like football. We finally have a prime minister who, by all accounts, really does like football, and yet he's unable to communicate that authentic part of himself in a way that people think is authentic. So it's an odd thing, isn't it? How the gap between who somebody is and what they can necessarily make people think when they interact with them, or certainly on a group of many people.
I also think back to a kind of, a law firm perspective. Whoever comes in, and clearly very unlikely that Starmer will stay, is going to need to pull together a sense of direction very, very quickly. Who are we? What are we about? Where are we? Where are we going? And they'll need to do that very, very quickly. I think otherwise it will still look as if they're directionless. I think that's absolutely key. Whoever comes in as leader needs to be able to articulate what the party is, what it's for, and where it's going and where it sees the country going. In the same way as when you often have, changes in leadership or post-merger in our sector, the ability to articulate a sense of self and a sense of direction very, very well is key. And we're not always great at that.
And next up, there's been some quite shocking news over the past couple of weeks that 3 lawyers have apparently been accessing confidential M&A data for the purposes of selling that on. So it's a massive insider trading scandal. I think we've seen a huge amount of coverage in the legal press. What that has meant in terms of the impact of the sector's reputation, I think is going to play out over the next few months and potentially years. So perhaps we can just dig into that. Alex, I mean, news like this is always pretty shocking. How do you think that this is going to impact the wider sector?
I'm probably the worst person to ask about getting shocked about law firms. I saw so much of the underside of law firms. My reporting takes a lot more than that. It's interesting. I was just chatting to Ben about this before. There are 6 firms that are named in the indictment from the Department of Justice. These are US-based firms. I mean, they're classed as victims. I think that phrase is actually used. So in terms of corporate liability, they seem to be in a reasonable position. These are indictments against people who did work for them. There aren't a lot of instances that have come to light of insider trading or this kind of misuse of information as is alleged in indictments. So the track record's generally pretty good. If this remains fairly isolated, I don't think the reputational hit to these firms or the industry in general will be that much of a problem. These things will seem to be happening. It's a batting average thing, I suppose. If it was to create more scrutiny and then a lot more of these cases came to light, then I think that would be a very different matter. And then the reputational hit and the implications would be very different, because these are all high prestige US firms that have been caught in the firing line. It's had a lot of coverage. What's your thinking, Ben?
I agree with you 100%, but even more so in terms of the precedent. If you take a step back and you look, the number of M&A deals, the number of huge transactions that go on, and the sheer number of those big US firms in and around them, and the amount of associates and partners that are on those deals, for this to feels so rare, and so I don't want to use the word shocking, but so I don't remember anything like this before, really. I think it reflects in a strange way very well on the sector that if you are lawyers are bound by very strict codes of behaviour, and yes, they get paid well, and there are incentives to do things like this or what's alleged here are probably less than if you are paid 1/3 as much, but you kind of think, well, if this is so newsworthy, we really the profession is ethical in the way it behaves. It's not like you're seeing like in some other industries where certain behavioral things happen all the time, and financial mismanagement, and there's huge amounts of regulation to prevent it. We don't have that. We don't need it. So although it's unfortunate, and we obviously want things to resolve and move on, I think the fact that it has been so newsworthy probably reflects the fact that it's rare, and lawyers, the legal profession is pretty much trusted, I think, as having solid standards of behaviour, and certainly in this country, very, very tightly regulated.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a pretty good track record in this area. I mean, there are other areas of ethics where the profession might look a little greater, but here that on both sides of the pond, they look pretty good. There's not been a lot of cases like this. Perhaps the bit that there might be more questions about is the rigor of the systems. I mean, law firms can be a little bit offhand around data or how rigorous the systems are. There's definitely training. There are systems, but these are big places. We've all heard stories of people leaving documents on trains or having phone calls where they're talking about client matters and people can overhear them. So there's very rare that the cases are with deliberate ill intent or to profit. Whether with a lot of scrutiny, there may be a little bit more questions asked about how serious the systems are, how serious. I mean, in this particular case, it looks like people were accessing deals that they had nothing to do with, and they were able to do that. So that's possibly the area that will get more attention.
Yeah, and I think thoughts and prayers to all the communications teams of the firms that have been mentioned. It must have been an incredibly difficult couple of weeks, and not a position to envy. Last up, we've had a big announcement from Anthropic, which has really cemented its place in the legal tech sector. So it announced on Tuesday that it's built a number of plugins for Claude, and that Claude is now going to be able to integrate with about 20 legal tech companies. So a serious play. I think raises a lot of questions about adoption and whether law firms are going to be able to successfully integrate this type of technology in a responsible manner. From your perspective, how's the news landed? Does this seem to be a positive?
There's so much to unpack and work out. Part of it in the background is you've got big tech versus big law. You've got large technology companies as opposed to specialist legal technology software providers, and what that means. There seem to be three big players at the moment. You've got Legora and Harvey as more established legal AI interfaces. Now you've got Anthropic as a big tech operator, which is moving rather rapidly into law, which seems to have happened this year in a couple of waves. And the initial announcements about some product development was enough to send share prices of some legal tech players sort of crashing. That was back in February. So there's so many implications here for how this plays out, what it means for law firms, what it means for the business model of law, and where the investment should go. And I think if you're a law firm, a chief innovation officer, just trying to work out which horse you should be backing or where you should be is that's one hell of a task right now. Ben, any thoughts?
I'm still slightly blown away by the advertising budgets of the Legora and Harvey in particular. If I see everywhere I go, I see Jude Law. But that aside, I don't know. For me, it's the legal profession tends to follow, doesn't it, in terms of decisions that big law makes. So nobody really goes out on a whim and buys software or anything else from slightly left field for a competitive advantage. And I think we're seeing that here. Whoever's going to win, I'm not sure. I quite like the Anthropic model, actually. I think it makes a lot of sense. But firms, yeah, there will be a clear winner in answer to your point, because firms generally are conservative, and if competitors are choosing a product or something, they will tend to do the same. We saw it years ago with CRM systems, which obviously slightly more modest compared to legal tech. But there was about 3 or 4 in the market, in the early days, and everybody went with one called Interaction. And the others, some of which were quite good, sort of disappeared. So there will be a clear winner. But the kind of concern I have is quite like it when firms or people try and do things in the left field to get a competitive advantage. Nobody really is going to do that. It's going to be buying a safe option. So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I think one challenge you get is there's all these tools. Some of them, when you look at them, clearly very powerful in what they do in and of themselves. But even for big law firms, having the staff that can really get their head around these individual tools, deploy what they can do, and then get in touch with how do you then plug them, turn them into workflow, then make them work with a dozen other systems, and because that's where the value is. It's where they all connect and plug in through various applications. Firms are struggling with that. I mean, they might love putting out a bunch of announcements and talking about how they're AI leaders, but even the biggest firms struggle with how to make that work as a business level competitive advantage.
Yeah, there's also another point as well. I mean, Linzi will know, like me, having worked in-house, getting all this stuff onto your system, it's not easy. Yes, some of it's in the cloud, etc., but the integration of technology in law firms is really, really complicated.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know things there, the pressure that must be on IT directors, because back in the day, I remember being part of change management communications programs at Central May, and we would be integrating whatever bit of software, but it would be a year in development, right? It would be a year to test, to have a few kind of pilot users, a working group, do. But now, with the rapid advance in AI, I don't think you've got that timeline really, and the pressure on people delivering infrastructure internally in firms must be really, really considerable. And you do worry that some systems may creak. That's kind of a concern really. If you're buying something like Claude that we're talking about, which has got all these bolt-ons and add-ons and everything else, putting that onto a already overcrowded system, which has to have the highest levels of cybersecurity on it, must be quite a challenge.
Absolutely. I mean, I worked on a tech-heavy project when I was in-house, and it took about 3 years. So I had a lot of painful meetings. One quick point that brings it back to sort of the media and comms, I think trying to make sense of this, I think there was a time that if you looked at the sort of specialist legal tech press, it was very vendor driven. It frankly existed in a very narrow niche. Now I think there's a lot more interesting stuff, and there's a lot more crossover with the business of law on what is shaping the industry. So looking at Caroline Hill's work on Legal IT Insider, looking at some of the lawyers' specialist tech coverage, I definitely find that I'm actually turning to some of that coverage a lot more to try and get my head around it. So I've had a few conversations with our retainers where I'm saying, no, these are not just narrow niches. They can be relevant to you as well in brand terms.
Great. Thank you both. There's some pretty meaty topics to tackle on a Friday afternoon, but I appreciate you joining me. And yeah, thanks for listening, and see you again next time.
You've been listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.